constructive treason. That's how John Taylor of Caroline blasted Alexander Hamilton for twisting the Constitution to justify the First National Bank. In 1794, Taylor published a direct assault on Hamilton's entire financial plan: the bank, debt, the funding system, the entire machine. Taylor called it a political papacy. In essence, a new aristocracy built on paper money, debt, and usurpation of power. So on this episode, you're going to learn about the forgotten assault on the system that gave us the largest government in history. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Friday, May 23rd, 2025. But let's get right to it. We got to go back to early 1794. The new federal government was barely getting into being 5 years old, but already John Taylor of Caroline saw major cracks forming. A growing alliance of political elite was using implied powers rather than delegated powers to destroy the limits of the Constitution and build a centralized machine. So he wrote this really long pamphlet titled An Enquiry into the Principles and Tendency of Certain Public Measures, and it ripped the whole thing to shreds. Of course, he sent it to President George Washington right as it was hitting the public. I think it was first printed in Philadelphia. Now, Taylor knew that Washington signed the very laws that he was about to tear apart, but he decided to go with truth rather than, well, excuse-making or ass-kissing. He said, in the spirit of truth and not of adulation, does the following performance solicit your attention? Nor is its hope of acquiring some share of your countenance diminished by the circumstance of your not having in an official character withheld your signature from several of the measures investigated. So, first paragraph in this letter sending this pamphlet to President Washington, he's acknowledging like, well, you didn't hold back, you didn't veto this stuff, but rather than just, beat around the bush, let's get right to it. He's got to go for the truth. And right out of the gate, Taylor warned that even a good constitution, this is in his pamphlet, a good constitution wouldn't or couldn't save the people, not if they let it be twisted by precedent or corrupted by the goals of those in power. He put it like this: as a bad form of government may by means of a good administration produce national happiness, so a good form of government may be abused into an engine of fraud and corruption. So he isn't taking the side on something right here, whether this was a good or a bad form. He's just pointing out one way or the other, it's not going to guarantee the same end result. John Dickinson had made a very similar argument during the ratification debates, writing as Fabius. He said a good administration promotes, but doesn't always produce a good administration. Anyways, Taylor continued with this: mischievous precedents or innovations upon the Constitution are matured by time into municipal regulations or fundamental rules. Then he described, well, what happens when the people allow unconstitutional precedent to become these fundamental rules. He said the wheat can only be separated by the chaff by sifting. Laziness in politics is like laziness in agriculture. It will expose the soil to noxious weeds. It's a killer, right? The wholesome plants, he said, will shrink from a state of indiscriminate amnesty, and disdaining a dishonorable society will leave the field in the possession of tares and thistles. Now, less than a year into Washington's second term, that's when this was going down, Taylor pointed out that, well, plenty of people were already saying this kind of thing out loud. He said, it is often asserted that the administration is driving at monarchy, that the legislature is corrupt, and that the Constitution has been more deliberately broken than it was formed. So this was becoming kind of a thing. And Taylor didn't dismiss this as just rumor or exaggeration. He thought it was important to acknowledge what people were saying and address it. He said, these assertions are alarming. These assertions are alarming. They deserve investigation. Now, next up, Taylor laid out a series of foundational principles under the Constitution. First, the Constitution created a republic, and anything that moves things towards a monarchy, well, breaks the entire system. He said that the Constitution contemplates a republican form of government. This is an unquestionable principle that he said, flowing from and depending on the people, and that a mode of administration destructive of such dependence and introductory of monarchical ingredients, doesn't have to be, the full-blown system, but even just introducing that is a noxious weed, and it's going to keep growing and kill the whole system. It innovates upon and subverts the Constitution. Second, he pointed out that Congress does indeed have a power to tax, but he rejects the notion of it being a wealth redistribution scheme. So this is kind of just shuts down the entire monster state of today, but that's a side story. He said that Congress can impose taxes for the common defense, and he highlighted common defense and general welfare of the United States, but not for the benefit of individuals or their own private emolument. And then he reminded us that the government is supposed to be just merely an agent of the people of the several states. And as soon as it goes beyond what the people of the several states have decided that the government is authorized to do, well, then he said, government is converted into a usurpation. Now, with that as his standard, that was the foundation, these essential principles. Taylor then looked at it and put the administration, the Washington administration, to the test. And he started out with what he saw as the heart of the entire problem: a system built to benefit the powerful few. That's how it was playing out. He said, it is about to be proved that a design for erecting aristocracy and monarchy is subsisting, that a money impulse, and not the public good, is operating on Congress, and that taxes are imposed upon motives other than the general welfare. Now, what was the foundation of all this? Well, it was Alexander Hamilton's First National Bank, which President Washington signed into law over the objection of his fellow Virginians, Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State, James Madison in the House, and Edmund Randolph, the first Attorney General. He still signed it into law. And Taylor put it like this: the leading evidence evincing these assertions is to be extracted from the bank scheme. I like that he doesn't just call it the bank or the bank law or the system. It's a scheme, which clearly sounds bad. The leading evidence evincing these assertions is to be extracted from the bank scheme, which was contrived, proposed, and modeled by the Secretary of the Treasury. That's Hamilton. And therefore, it is selected as the first subject of investigation. Now, the first problem with this national bank system that made it a scheme, really, Taylor pointed out that it wasn't funded with real money. The stockholders bought in using government debt. He said this same worshipful aristocracy, favored of government for the bulk of their bank stock, were not even obliged to deposit money. Public securities, he said, carrying an interest of 6% for 3/4 of the whole amount, are by law receivable as a deposit. So they could buy it using government debt. And you can think of this government debt at the time kind of like a precursor to U.S. treasuries, treasury bonds. And Gordon Wood, in his great book, Empire of Liberty, he explained how it went down. Basically, there were a bunch of people through the war that had these securities, these early kind of precursors to treasuries, this government debt, and no one was getting paid for it. So what happened was some speculators came in, kind of the Hamiltonian side of things. They came in and they bought it on pennies on the dollar. Maybe it was 10 cents on the dollar, something really, really cheap. And everyone at the time was told, well, that's all you're ever going to get. And here's how Wood put it. During the 1780s, much of the debt had been bought up by speculators at a fraction of its face value. And many of these speculators had little expectation that the debt and interest would be paid in full and in specie. But then once Hamilton had some influence, suddenly things changed because Hamilton's plan let these speculators who bought this debt for pennies on the dollar use that cheap debt at full face value to buy stock in the New National Bank. So if you bought $10 worth of debt for $1, you could use that $10 face value to buy $10 worth of U.S. First National Bank stock. And Taylor called it what it was. He said, had so much public debt been honestly and not artificially accumulated, it must have been earned by labor, which would have produced a general distribution of it, obviating an exorbitant accumulation of wealth in a few private hands. He said its chief design, this whole system, this plan, he said this chief design was to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. And for Taylor, the end result was this. The law, the bank bill, created a system where ordinary people did the work, did the labor, but because of government favoritism, government intervention, and government programs, the rewards flowed upwards to a privileged few. Of course, we're always told that it's the opposite. When government gets in, it benefits the average people, but Taylor is pointing out how this went the other way around. He said a portion of the rich class of citizens are the proprietors of the device, whilst labor supports it. An annuity to a great amount is suddenly conjured up by law, which is received exclusively by the rich, that is the aristocracy. Will it not make them richer? So government intervention is benefiting a privileged few, those with connections. And now, of course, Taylor's warning didn't focus solely on this get-rich-quick scheme that was happening. He made it clear that the whole plan was an attack on the Constitution itself. He put it like this. If a number of the members of Congress are stockholders or bank directors, then an illegitimate interest is operating on the national legislature. There is an undue influence from this banking system on the legislature because those members of Congress would more likely want to do things that benefit the bank because it's going to benefit their pocketbook. It's kind of a long-standing thing in government. He said, then the bank hath seduced away from their natural and constitutional allegiance the representatives of the states. And then on top of it, he warned that the system was ripe for foreign intrigue, foreign influence, even foreign domination. And he didn't hold back at all. He said, and then even foreigners, our late most malignant and inveterate enemy, have obtained an influence on our national councils so far as they have obtained bank stock. All you have to do is buy your way in, and you can control the system that influences the legislature. He said, the English, who could not conquer us, may buy us. And this is pretty good, I think. Foolish English to expend hundred millions in fighting for the power of legislation when a 20th part of the money will peaceably obtain it by purchase. So he's warning whether or not they use that system, that it is ripe for corruption, control, and even being conquered by foreigners. Now, while it wasn't the same as the fiat money system, the paper money system that we live under today, the law also allowed for the bank to issue paper notes. And here from the National Park Service, they point out the banknotes issued by the first bank gave the U.S. the closest thing to a national currency at the time. First banknotes were also the only ones accepted when paying federal taxes, which the first bank was in charge of collecting. I'm going to go a little further on paper money and the notes in just a moment, but I first want to mention that I know I'm citing a bunch of stuff here, but primarily it's going to be John Taylor of Caroline's great pamphlet from 1794. But we also have a few other source documents throughout this episode. They will all be included in a blog post for this episode over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Alan Mosley does an awesome job getting that organized. We should all be very grateful for him. I know I am. I love him. And he does a great job getting that organized. And in the show links section in the blog post below the audio and video player and all that other stuff, the intro and the title, you'll see the reference links generally in the order that I'm going through it in the episode. That way, if this is interesting to you, you can read and learn more in context on your own time. Again, that's 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. But let's get back to it and talk about those banknotes. Because in theory, all those banknotes were going to be redeemable in gold or silver. They were going to be redeemable 100% in specie. And most people would say, even if you're sound money people, say, well, if you're going to have a note, it's going to be a promissory note. It's not going to really be a currency. It's just a representation of real money, sound money, gold or silver, and you can transfer it in and swap it out at the original bank at any time. And that's how it's supposed to work. But as Alexander Hamilton pointed out in his report on the National Bank when he was pushing to get it established, this is December of 1790, the bank would be able to issue more notes than gold and silver held in reserve, basically an early system of fractional reserve banking. If you want to learn more on that, that's definitely Mises.org. But here's how Hamilton put it. It is a well-established fact that banks in good credit can circulate a far greater sum than the actual quantum of their capital in gold and silver. So, well established that they can do this. Not this necessarily a good idea. For Hamilton, of course, it was a great idea because the more that you do this, the more that government ends up having power. Now, according to the St. Louis Federal Reserve, I'm not one to cite these people too often, but sometimes if you want to do some research, they do tell you the history of these things. This is exactly how it played out. They said the first bank of the United States, throughout its 20-year life, roughly maintained a loan-to-specie ratio of about 5-to-1. Not nearly as bad as it is today, but certainly I'm sure some of the big government people that love the Federal Reserve System of today certainly learned from that. This was the foundation. And John Taylor of Caroline was not happy about this paper system that was being set up at all, especially if you consider what went down during the Revolution and afterwards. He said, the nation, but just emerged from the unforeseen misfortunes of paper money, are suddenly overwhelmed by the ruin of a paper policy. So some people didn't actually learn until they learned by experience. And Taylor's pointing out, look what we just went through. This has been really bad. Now, if you're not aware of what went down, if you've ever heard the phrase or something similar to it, not worth a continental, that came from the massive inflation, the money printing, the paper money system caused during the War for Independence or created during the War for Independence. It was getting devalued really, really fast. And Taylor went back to that as well. He said the calamities of the last war, resulting from the banishment of specie by a paper medium, were probably equivalent to those produced by the sword. Bad money drives out good. That's the theory. And he's saying the damage done by that during the war were equivalent to those done by the violence of the war itself. He said the banking contrivances are rapidly reducing us again to the same ruinous and miserable situation. Then Taylor brought it back to the text of the Constitution, making the case that the whole thing is illegal under Article 1, Section 10. He said the Constitution, in terms framed from a consideration of the mischiefs heretofore produced by paper mediums, strives most carefully to interdict them in future. So he's saying we learn from our experience in the war. And so the Constitution actually aimed to prevent that same kind of experience. He said, in dealing out power to Congress relative to a currency, it permits that body to coin money. And in restraining the power of states, this is Article 1, Section 10, it prohibits them from coining money, emitting bills of credit, or making anything a tender but gold and silver. That wasn't the end of it. Taylor did not let up here. Instead, he drove his point home that the Constitution doesn't just prefer sound money, it actually slammed the door shut on paper. Here's how he put it. In not giving the power of establishing a paper currency to the one, and in taking it expressly from the other, the Constitution designed to secure the society against the frauds and vices of paper tricks. Breaking that down, he's basically taking the position that the power delegated to Congress to coin money is not the same as the power delegated to Congress to print paper currency. The latter doesn't exist. It's not in the text. So, and I know there's another side to that argument. And if you want to hear that back and forth, maybe in a debate form or something, I can cover that in a future episode. But John Taylor's position is that there is no power delegated to Congress to print a paper currency. And then in Article 1, Section 10, the other side has been expressly prohibited from doing that. That's the states. And that's how the Constitution was specifically designed to secure against these paper tricks. He said that circulating paper medium of every kind was intended to be inhibited is obvious from the distinction between such a medium and making anything a tender. Now, Taylor's next target was the system of national debt itself. Debt, debt, and debt, ongoing. And here's what he started with. I love how he puts this. A minister intoxicated with influence will exclaim, public debt is a public blessing, or taxes are an incitement to industry. I mean, I don't know anyone in their right mind saying this type of thing. I know there are people who are not in their right mind today, many of them. But the notion that a public debt and always having a public debt, that doesn't mean necessarily ripping off the people that you owe money to. Pay them off, but always taking on more, never letting it go to zero. And having taxation is somehow a way to make people more industrious. To me, that's nonsensical. But of course, he was specifically targeting Alexander Hamilton, who wrote exactly that. And he was very well known for this position. He wrote this to Robert Morris under the Articles of Confederation in 1781. He said a national debt, and he did have a caveat here, which you'll see, but a national debt, if it is not excessive, will be to us a national blessing. It will be powerful cement of our union. It will also create a necessity for keeping up taxation to a degree which, without being oppressive, will be a spur to industry. Now, James Madison later said a public debt is a public curse. I mean, everyone knew this position from the Hamiltonians, from Hamilton himself, so it was cited often over the years. But Hamilton also believed that taxation was a good thing, and it would come from having this ongoing national debt. And Hamilton's program under the Constitution was built to keep the United States in debt, probably permanently. Again, that didn't mean that he was going to say you're going to rip off your creditors. It's just that you are going to always take on more. And Taylor took no prisoners on this. He said, where does the Constitution contemplate an influential character in the person of a Secretary of the Treasury, entitling him to prescribe to Congress political dogmas? And this is one of the things people were like, what? Who is this guy? This guy from the executive branch? I know Brian McClanahan mentioned this recently in a podcast, but who's this guy from the Secretary of the Treasury? This is the executive branch. Why is he coming down here interfering in our proceedings in Congress? You're not part of the legislature. And what are you doing giving us these political dogmas? And that's what Taylor's saying here as well. He said, or whence arises the right of the federal government to apply stimulants to industry? Where in the Constitution is the federal government authorized to stimulate any type of industry? It is not. And so he's saying none of this is constitutional, but out. Now, in a letter to President George Washington back in 1792, so about a year and a half before Taylor wrote this pamphlet, Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson called Hamilton's addiction to debt a tool of power and control. He saw it for what it was. He said, "This exactly marks the difference between Colonel Hamilton's views and mine, that I would wish the debt paid tomorrow. He wishes it never to be paid, but always to be a thing wherewith to corrupt and manage the legislature." Again, a tool of power, a tool of control, and a way to always have more taxation. And Taylor followed up with the almost same kind of a message in 1794. He said, "It was and is the fashion of thinking that a public debt unequally held gives permanency and weight to government, gives more power and strength, makes it more energetic for the government. That is," he said, "to use plain terms, it will enable the government to control the will of the people." And of course, some of those principles that he was talking about earlier in the pamphlet were that, well, the legislature is acting supposedly, at least in theory, under the will of the people. They're representing the people. So if you can manage the legislature, just like Thomas Jefferson was describing Hamilton was trying to do, you're really trying to manage the will of the people. So he said, that is, to use plain terms, it will enable government to control the will of the people by counterbalancing it with the weight of wealth. He said, the Constitution is compiled upon a principle precisely in opposition to this idea. The sovereignty of the people gave it birth, and it acknowledges their parental authority. And Taylor saw Hamilton's plan for the federal government to assume state war debts. He saw that also as designed to centralize, consolidate power. He said to dissolve all money relationship between individuals and the separate states would, on the one hand, diminish state power and tend to consolidation, and on the other hand, create an undue influence by which the consolidated power might be managed. So that was part of Hamilton's plan, was that the federal government was going to assume all the debts from the states, and then you would have it all in one place, consolidated, centralized. But when you do that, maybe it's more efficient to get that handled, but it also creates an environment where you have more power in fewer hands. And pretty much everyone knew at this point that Hamilton actually wanted to get rid of the states. On June 18th, I think, in 1787, he gave this really long speech of what he really would have preferred for the Constitution. And in essence, his view was, well, we got to keep the states only because if we tried to get rid of them, we'd get too much opposition. Otherwise, his preference would be to have one singular national blob, a nationwide system, one size fits all. That was his real desire, his approach. And Taylor, I think, could see how this would play out. Take on the state debt, then federal taxation would ensue, and then, well, you keep centralizing power and control. He said a recurrence to direct taxation by Congress, because that's not what they had under the Articles of Confederation. He said, we'll swallow up the little sovereignty now left to the once sovereign individual states. And every accumulation of the debts of the Union is an impulse towards that end. So you're turning from a union of sovereign independent states to a kind of a system of federalism, kind of halfway in between, and then taking that halfway in between system and using these tools to continue consolidating and centralizing power in practice and effect. And it was the bank, of course. The bank was the tool that would facilitate all of this. It would basically make this whole takeover happen, not slow, but fast. He said the funding system was intended to affect what the bank was contrived to accelerate. 1, an accumulation of great wealth in a few hands. 2, a political moneyed engine. And 3, a suppression of the Republican state assemblies by depriving them of the political importance resulting from the imposition and dispensation of taxes. And John Taylor saw this basically as a full-blown kind of a counter-revolution against the structure of the Constitution, against the will of the people, the sovereignty of the people of the several states. And he said, and hence, the tone of this instrument also, in its several vibrations, harmonizes with the perilous design radically to destroy the Constitution. Lots of debt, taxation, and a central bank is a destruction of the Constitution. And here we are today. Let me say that again. And hence the tone of this instrument also, in its several vibrations, harmonizes with the perilous design radically to destroy the Constitution and to erect upon its ruins a usurpation not sanctioned by the national will or acknowledging the fundamental principle that the people are the only legitimate fountain of civil government. Now, Taylor warned that Hamilton's justification for this plan, the legal arguments that he made that somehow the Constitution authorized this, it was implied powers or constructive powers is how they would describe it. He thought that implied powers was the root cause of the entire problem. He said those who argue in favor of the constitutionality of the corporation are reduced to the narrow ground of asserting that a power is tacitly implied, conflicting and subverting the most fundamental principles, earnestly and loudly expressed. So he's saying, like, look, all you can do, because this is not an expressly delegated power. The only thing you can say is that this is tacitly implied. And even James Wilson, one of the other big government guys during the ratification debates, he ended up going on the Supreme Court under George Washington, but he made the case that the powers delegated to Congress are not through tacit implication, but instead through the positive grant in the instrument of the Union. So tacit implication is usurpation of power. Taylor did not pull any punches on this at all, because he said the people pushing those implied powers, they weren't just wrong, they were criminals, and criminals probably of the worst kind. He said constructive powers are like constructive treasons. Taylor, in his long pamphlet, it's like 100 pages basically, depending on your font size, of course, but he also went into a lot of detail explaining how Hamilton's system would lead to corruption, debt, usurpation, consolidation, lawless power, but he didn't leave us without a hint of a solution, at least. He has a bunch of sections on solutions, and he started out with this. Therefore, if liberty is a national object, the nation itself must watch over the Constitution, preserve it from violation, and supply its defects, or admit it to be the leth of the community, producing an entire forgetfulness of the rights of man. So he's basically saying the same thing again that Dickinson said in Fabius number 4, arguing for ratification of the Constitution in April of 1788. He said, when there's a bad administration, what is to be done? He said, the answer is to be instantly found before the supreme sovereignty of the people, the final authority of the people. He said, it is their duty to watch and their right to take care that the Constitution be preserved. Or in the Roman phrase on perilous occasions, to provide that the republic receive no damage. So here he is, John Taylor of Caroline, basically making the argument that the Federalists made in support of ratification in 1788, or at least John Dickinson, but you could also say people like James Iredell and a few others. So he's basically saying that the people of the several states have to get the job done. And he gave us 3 steps. First, and well, this should probably be obvious, but it never seems to work out this way. Don't pick such crappy people to be in the House of Representatives. Stop choosing them. Stop supporting them. The second one was actually taken from us because he focused on saying, well, the state legislatures can really influence the federal government because they're the ones who choose the senators. That's gone thanks to the 17th Amendment. But the third, the states themselves. He said, through the organs of state legislatures. He said the state legislatures have at least as good a right to judge of every infraction of the Constitution as Congress itself. Constructive powers, constructive treason. It ends when the people of the several states stand up and say no. Long forgotten and almost totally ignored, John Taylor of Caroline hits like a hammer. So we shouldn't be surprised that the government-run and government-approved school system, the education system they call it, never teaches any of this stuff. But the 10th Amendment Center has it covered. And this is a big part of the reason why we work so hard every single day to reach and teach more and more people about these essential foundational principles. And nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that quickly depreciating, devalued, dirty government fiat paper money, please consider throwing it our way. No one punches above their weight class and uses that tool against the system better than the TAC. You can join us for as little as $2 a month over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. It's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. You could mail in options. We'll take sound money. If you got gold backs or other forms of sound money, hit us up. We'll make it happen. Absolutely. And we prefer that as well anyways. So again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, all spelled out. And I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us as a member today. If you don't want to join as a member, but still want to help out financially, that's pretty awesome to me. Either way, whatever works for you works for me. I'm very grateful for your support. You can pitch in one time over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. And whether you're able to pitch in financially or not, there's a bunch of free and easy peasy things that you can do to help us spread the word, primarily by triggering the algorithms of the mainstream platforms you may watch or listen on. For example, on video platforms like YouTube. If you have a lot of watch time percentage, it really helps out the algorithm a lot more. So if it's a 10-minute video and you watch 8 minutes, that's 80%. If it's 20 minutes, that's 200%. Let's go for the 200. You can also leave reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, comments in the archive, hit the like button, get notifications, subscribe, all that stuff. All the stuff you can do to interact with the platform, plus sharing links and tweeting and all of those things. I'm very grateful for your support, whether it's financial, otherwise, combination of the two. I'm just very grateful that you spent this much time with me here today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it was interesting, maybe a little entertaining here and there as well. I do my best on all of that. But more important than anything, I hope it made you think, and I hope you learned something. I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you have an awesome weekend and maybe a long one. And I look forward to seeing you next week, Wednesday, on the path to liberty.